of August 2025. Welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. I want to pick up where I left off yesterday because of the immediacy of the importance of what is going to happen this Friday and what could happen between now and Friday to make sure it doesn't happen. Now, we're near to where the future Bering Strait tunnel finally connecting Russia and China will soon be, there is a town that I referred to yesterday called Kotzebue. Kotzebue is a half hour by air just north of Nome in the Bering Strait, and it sits just north of the Arctic Circle. I landed there in June of the year that I was there in a 737 out of Anchorage, and it was the second week of June when there is no darkness. It's light all night long. In fact, you could play flag football out in the street at night. It's so bright. But it was full of fog. It was just kind of strange that morning we landed there, north of the Arctic Circle. Now, this town called Kotzebue is named after the Russian explorer Otto von Kotzebue, who was the son of the playwright August von Kotzebue, and on behalf of the Russian Imperial Navy, the same Navy that Catherine the Great earlier deployed as part of her 1780 League of Armed Neutrality, which indirectly supported the American Revolution by protecting neutral shipping in the United States from interference by the British Navy. Otto von Kotzebue explored the Bering Strait in pursuit of a new passage to the Arctic Ocean, and as a result of Russia's later sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867, 5 years after Russia had also supported the Union cause by sending its navy to the ports of New York and San Francisco to prevent Britain and France from breaking Lincoln's blockade of the Confederacy. Russia's mainland coast is just 55 miles from Seward Peninsula of the United States. Yesterday I said 35. It's 55 miles. And technically, the two countries, each of which owns one of the Diomede Islands, are actually much closer. They're only 2.4 miles apart. If you want to get really particular about it, between the eastern edge of Siberia and the western edge of Alaska, right in the middle of the Bering Strait are these two tiny islands, the Diomedes. Russia has the one on the west. The United States has the one on the east. So if you want to be really technical about it, other than Mexico and Canada, the closest nation to the United States geographically is Russia, just 2.4 miles away. Now, I said all of that to say this. Could the 8 decades of hostility between Russia and the United States, two nations which prior to then had not only fought each other but had been allied in opposition to the British Empire, now finally be overcome? I mean, was that hostility instigated by Winston Churchill in his Operation Unthinkable proposal to go to war with the Soviet Union no later than July of 1945, a month before the atomic explosions, well before the end of the war in the Pacific? Is that empire, this British Empire and its lackeys, right now attempting to foment war with Russia involving the United States up to this very moment? Now, readers of the EIR, aware that since July 30, documents released by Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard have provided clues that may yet figure in answering that very question. In his August 5th article, Whistleblower exposes real 2016 U.S. election meddling, the journalist Kit Clarenberg, reporting on those documents, tells the story of a U.S. intelligence veteran who from 2015 to 2020 served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the ODNI overseeing National Intelligence Council. He said they specialized in cyber issues, including cyber-enabled information operations. And prior to the 2016 vote, they led the production of an intelligence community assessment on cyber threats to U.S. elections at the order of Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, for which they were commended. Klarenberg then quotes that source from one of the documents Gabbard released. Quote, "For the new 2017 ICA, Intelligence Community Assessment, I was directed by," and it's redacted, it's blacked out, "to focus on Russian attempts to access U.S. election-related infrastructure. The intelligence community reporting suggested many Russia attributed for what the initials IP stand for. IP addresses were making connection attempts that the intelligence community could not explain the purpose of. Later, when presenting, redacted, with our findings, redacted, directed us to abandon any further study of the subject, saying, it's something else. In light of later development in open source reporting, I came to have concerns about this Russia-attributed cyber activity and the abrupt dismissal of the study effort," end quote. Now, very important in this release, Klarenberg said, "In addition, I noted other nations' efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election, but this critical context was omitted from the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment. During conversation of the 2017 unclassified versions, key context was not included, and I was pressured to alter my views on the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment's key judgments, with the expressed intent by," redacted, "that my concurrence was sought to enable," redacted, "to sway the views of the Defense Intelligence Agency." So here we have insiders now coming out, backing up what Tulsi Gabbard has been claiming. So my question is, will Great Britain's intelligence operatives, former head Robert Hannigan and former MI6 chief Richard Dearlove, be among those foreign nationals accused, instead of the Russians, of co-managing the attempt before and after the 2016 election to alter the presidency of the United States? Because as Klarenberg was saying in this release, other nations, it wasn't Russia, it was other nations, but they don't say who, because when this came forward, the study was abruptly stopped. Why would you abruptly stop an investigation? Except to protect what was being revealed in the investigation. So as President Trump and President Putin, both of whom have survived assassination attempts in the last 18 months, preparing to meet this Friday, and you want to kind of note Vice President Vance's comments on a Fox News interview regarding the criminal referrals Gabbard has made to Attorney General Pam Bondi regarding Russiagate, that Vance said that's a violation of what our intelligence services should be doing, and I absolutely think they broke the law. So we can tell by Vance's comments about the documents Tulsi Gabbard has that he believes them and expects indictments. So a new security and development architecture obviously needs to be the focus not only of this Friday meeting, but of the subsequent Big Three meeting in early September among President Trump, President Putin, and Xi Jinping. President Xi, who spent months in the state of Iowa as a student and has an appreciation of American history, might be intrigued to know, if he is not already aware of it, that Abraham Lincoln's ambassador to Russia, Cassius Marcellus Clay, who played a secondary but essential role in Secretary of State William Seward's purchase of Alaska from Russia, was among the first American diplomats to urge Russian-American identity of interest in Eastern Asia. According to author Albert Perry, and during the Second World War in the spring of 1943, Perry wrote in his article saying, Cassius Clay's glimpse into the future, Lincoln's envoy to St. Petersburg, bade the two nations meet in Asia. So, as of this coming September 2 and 3, 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, in which the United States, China, and Russia were all allied, the dream to connect the East and West through the Bering Strait, equally a dream of the Chinese and the Russian and American thinkers and engineers, may actually be discussed in this Friday meeting. That's the mountaintop standpoint from which to view the true potential, despite the dangers of the upcoming summit process, and what could happen in order to try to stop it from happening. Now, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, reflecting on the combined but uneven evolving state of U.S.-Russia relations, said in an interview on Russia 1 on Sunday, August 10th, quote, some sprouts of common sense are appearing in the dialogue with the U.S., which have been sorely lacking in recent months and years, end quote. Now, he at the same time discussed Russia's recent decision to lift its own self-imposed ban on deploying intermediate-range missiles. You remember last month, Putin finally said, okay, he didn't say let loose the dogs of war, but he said let loose the intermediate-range missiles that they have been keeping under cover. Why? Well, because the West is getting ready to put intermediate-range missiles and long-range missiles into the Ukraine. So Ryabkov says the Americans and their allies, especially the European warmongers, are undertaking this change, so Russia had to change. So in his interview with Russia 1, Ryabkov made it clear that besides the now famous Oreshnik missile, Russia has developed other advanced missile technologies. He said, the Oreshnik, yes, but we have other weapons. We haven't wasted any time. I cannot dwell on what I'm not supposed to, but we have such weapons. In commenting on the potential deployment of Russian weapons to new regions, he said, it would be absolutely wrong and irresponsible of me to disclose concrete geographical locations. You know, like President Trump did. We're sending 2 Ohio-class submarines to your border. And remember, these submarines are supposed to be sitting still, monitoring what's going on, and waiting for some signal to act as an Ohio-class submarine. Well, they got the signal that 2 of them are supposed to approach Russia. Well, as soon as these big old behemoths come off their sitting spot on the ocean floor and start moving, the Russian Navy knows where they're at. As opposed to Ryabkov saying, well, we're not going to tell you where these things are. TASS also reminded some and recounted for the first time for others the wildly dangerous days of the Biden administration and NATO's deployment via the Ukraine of long-range missile attacks on Russia last fall. Ryabkov says Russian President Vladimir Putin said on November 21 that the United States and its NATO allies had announced their approval for the use of long-range precision weapons. Following this announcement, Russian military sites in the Kursk and Bryansk regions were attacked with American and British missiles. In response, Russia used its newest intermediate-range ballistic missile, the Oreshnik, in a non-nuclear strike targeting Ukraine's Yuzhmash defense plant in Dnipro, formerly known as Petrovsk. And the Russian president warned that the West could bring upon itself heavy consequences should its inflammatory policies prompt further escalation of this conflict. So this, both the potential for sanity and the present reality of a reckless escalation could prove unstoppable past a certain point. So it's true that the nuanced circumstances of Friday, August 15th, Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, and heaven help us if it gets interrupted. Now, a coalition met with Vance in London. The UN Foreign Secretary, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy, hosted a meeting yesterday at his Chevening House estate, which was attended by Vice President Vance and European national security advisors, thought to include the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Ukraine's former defense minister and now head of Kyiv's National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, along with the head of the Office of the President, Andrei Yermak, and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Keith Kellogg were there, and it supported the Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, and Sky News reported that the meeting had been called at Washington's request. Now, let me put this in context. Here you have some very powerful heavy hitters from the Vice President of the United States down yesterday meeting with heavy hitters in England, supposedly also attended by France and Germany. Why? Why? And it was called at the behest, it was held at the behest of the United States. Why? What were they going to be discussing? Man, I would love to have been the proverbial fly on the wall of that meeting. Because you know they're talking about the summit this Friday in Alaska. Now, prior to that meeting, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer discussed a plan for how to deal with Vance, with French President Macron and Ukraine's acting president, the clown himself, Zelensky. Prior to that meeting, Starmer is trying to figure out how to deal with Vance by talking to Macron and Zelensky. You can't come up with something better than that? So a Downing Street spokeswoman said that Starmer and Macron, quote, discussed the latest developments in the Ukraine, reiterating their unwavering support for President Zelensky and to securing a just and lasting peace for the Ukrainian people. You know, the BS just never ends. So in a post on social media, Yermak said that they made clear to Vance, they made clear to Vance that a reliable, lasting peace is only possible with Ukraine at the negotiating table, with full respect for our sovereignty and without recognizing the occupation. Is that why they were meeting with Vice President Vance and Rubio and Witkoff and Kellogg yesterday? Trying to make sure that Vance understands, and of course he will relate this to his president, Trump, that a lasting peace cannot take place. Negotiations can't even go forward. There's no sense in sitting down and talking about this unless Zelensky, representing the Ukraine, is at the table. You know what this reminds me of? Here's your trivia question of the morning. What was the U.S. ship sitting in Tokyo Harbor where the Japanese surrender occurred on deck with MacArthur? What was it? Yeah, you're right, the Missouri. The flagship of the U.S. Navy at this particular time in history. And here you have the American contingent represented by MacArthur, and then you have those representing the emperor on the deck of the Missouri. Can you imagine the Japanese saying, and nothing against the Japanese, but can you imagine the Japanese saying, we'll sign the surrender only under these conditions? Do you know why the surrender was called an unconditional surrender? Because the Western allies, represented there by the U.S. Navy, was not about to sit there and deal with various requests, demands on the part of the Japanese contingency to sign that document. There's a reason why Zelensky will not be at that summit meeting this Friday in Alaska, because the war is over. The Ukrainians have lost, and it's not going to be 2 months before the Russians are on the shores of the Dnieper River. And they don't want to go any further than that. Russia doesn't want the Ukraine, but they're going to keep the Russian part of the Ukraine. They're not going to give that up. And they're not about to do tit for tat with Zelensky over what's necessary for the ceasefire. Now, that's part of what's going to be discussed, is some kind of a ceasefire. But why would the Russians cease fire when the Ukrainians are on the run? And because it's not a war, they're not looking for an unconditional surrender. It's a special military operation that was necessary to stop the murder of the ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine that had been going on since 2014. Over 12 to 13,000 innocent Ukrainian citizens of Russian extraction being constantly bombed for years. Okay, you know those. You know, I don't need to go into that. But here you have these Western leaders sitting down with the Vice President of the United States, making sure he understands what's up. Oh, gosh, I wish I could have heard that meeting. So prepping for a splendid little nuclear war, Great Britain now leads the world in the increase year on year of its expenditures on nuclear weapons, says the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in a just published report. Now, while global spending on nukes increased by 11%, alarming enough in itself, Great Britain saw an increase in expenditure of 26%, rising to $10.4 billion during 2024. China's total nuclear weapons expenditure was $12 billion, while larger than Britain, exceeds it only by 25%. So last year, the United States spent $57 billion, about 4.5 times China's nuclear payout. And more than half of that whole world estimated at just over $100 billion in nuclear arms development last year. And looking more closely at this gives another dimension to what the British mean by their special relationship with the United States, especially when it comes to the deployment and the potential use for nuclear weapons. Because the nukes that are at Lockheath and at other places in the UK are controlled 100% by the United States. The Brits can't launch them. But because of this special relationship, the Brits are trying to get the codes. And spending on nuclear weapons among the 9 nations that admit they have nukes has risen in the last 5 years by 39%, with the total amount from 2019 to 2013 or 23, $416 billion in just 4 years on nuclear arms development. Now, Russia, which is the world's leading nuclear military power, only spent $8 billion in 2024, which is 20% less than Great Britain, and only 14% of what the U.S. spent. So nations that increased their nuclear weapons disbursement the most year on year were Great Britain, followed by Pakistan, then by France, and then by the United States. I think it's interesting to consider the expenditures of each nation against that nation's population, something that neither report nor the article will do. But it's an exercise that requires only a cell phone calculator to conduct it. So as I've jumbled through these numbers, the results reveal that the expenditure per person comes out to $150 for Great Britain, $55 for Russia, $8 for China, And even in the case of Pakistan, which saw the second highest rate of expenditures, the per person rate is only $4.38. Where do we figure into that? The highest, $167 per citizen of the United States spent on nuclear development in 2024. Now, there's a good article at Zero Hedge covering the report, Nuclear Weapons Spending is on the Rise, where you can get more information about this. All right, I want to get to Israel. But we're halfway through already. So there was this, Israel has, of course, killed 5 more journalists. How far do I want to go into that? I think I'm going to hold off on that for a little bit. See if I can squeeze it in towards the end of the program. Well, there's something playing at K-Talk. Now, I was going to read a letter to you. I think I'm going to skip over that too, because there's some other things here that I definitely want to get to. Following up on the criminal referrals the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, submitted to Attorney General Pam Bondi on the manufacture of the Russiagate narrative, Vice President Vance told Fox News host Maria Bartiromo this last weekend that indictments were coming. Indictments are coming for, he said, defrauding the American people, defrauding the intelligence agencies, lying about what the intel said. That's a violation of the people's trust. That's a violation of what our intelligence services should be doing, and I absolutely think they broke the law. You're going to see a lot of people get indicted for that. Now, Vice President Vance just said that. And you know what? This group of 6 or 7 or 8, whatever it was, headed by President Obama, because it was Obama who said, we're going to change the story. They knew 1 month, they knew before the election in 2016 that there was no substance to Russiagate. And then a month after, to repeat what I talked about last week, and I know you've heard this from other sources, less than a month, or about a month after the election in November of 2016, these people met in the Oval Office. Clapper, Brennan, Rice, Newland, Kerry, Comey, they're all meeting, and by their own records, Obama says, we're going to turn the story around. We're going to create the Russiagate story because we have to disable Trump's ability to be president during the next 4 years. So we have to question how he was elected. That's not just defrauding the intelligence agencies, that's treason. Treason from the highest office in the United States, the president. And what was their answer to this? The only one who said anything, if you want to call it substantive, was President Obama, who said, oh, it's a bunch of BS. There's no truth. There's no truth to it. Well, we'll see after a grand jury reviews these documents that were created by the administration themselves. It's not some, whistleblowing journalist who comes out and says, looky what I found. All right, now, some other stuff I want to get to here. After 4 days of relatively clear statements by President Trump, Secretary of State Rubio, Vice President Vance indicating that the United States and Russia would be meeting this Friday would put up front the larger strategic issues considering these two nations. And the U.S. media, watch what they do, watch what they've already done with this, and watch what they're doing in changing their tactics. Because they've shifted away from simply misreporting the August 6th meeting, Moscow meeting of Putin and Witkoff. Now their main accusation is that Witkoff is incompetent and he's been suckered in by the far more clever Vladimir Putin. Now, Witkoff is a smart cookie. I think he's smarter than Trump. I think that's why Trump put him in that position. And now the media is saying, when Witkoff comes out and is pointing to the hopeful outcome of this Friday meeting, 3 days away from now, the main media is saying Witkoff has been suckered in by the far more clever Putin. Newsweek's report yesterday said this: Trump envoy slammed for damaging incompetence over Putin talks. It just indicates the type of desperation and obfuscation that one can now expect to encounter nearly every hour between now and the August 15th summit of Trump and Putin. Newsweek, for example, takes various media allegations to what Witkoff is reported to have said, comparing those to what is said to be actually Witkoff's statements, and then concluded that the discrepancy is not due to flawed reporting, but to Vice President Vance's incompetence. Just completely unabashed gaslighting in defense of the media intelligence echo chamber. And it started with the Wall Street Journal reporting, citing anonymous sources, of course they're anonymous, that Witkoff had negotiated that Moscow would withdraw from Zaporizhia and the Kherson regions in exchange for Kyiv withdrawing from the Donetsk region and conceding Lugansk. Then the next day, the Wall Street Journal changes it, saying that Witkoff had arranged for Moscow not to withdraw, but to freeze the front line in exchange for a ceasefire. Finally, a few hours later, it was said that Witkoff's arrangement of the ceasefire was in exchange for Ukraine's withdrawal from Donetsk. While the premise was put forth that Witkoff had changed his story, in fact, it was the Wall Street Journal, with their anonymous sources, adjusting their various versions. Then Newsweek then went to Michael McFaul, Obama's ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, to weigh in. Quote, "This is deeply damaging incompetence. Witkoff should finally start taking a note-taker from the U.S. Embassy for future meetings. That's how professional diplomacy works." Then Newsweek piled on, quoting Michael Weiss, that the U.S. envoy is grossly incompetent and his confusion is causing diplomatic crises. Then Gary Kasparov, who I've quoted in the past, a proponent of the dismemberment of Russia, said, like so most of Trump's appointees, Witkoff's only qualification is that Trump is sure that he will put Trump's personal interest and desires over American national interests without a second thought. Of course he's incompetent. Hence the headline, Trump envoy slammed for damaging incompetence over Putin talks. That is how you make mainstream media sausage out of world historical events. So there's a certain irony over the Trump-Putin meeting and the Steele dossier. London's Telegraph, in its contribution to the imperial freakout over the upcoming Trump-Putin meeting, said this, quote, "Putin has received yet another gift from Trump." And it was a Saturday article from Fiona Hill, the UK's expert to the colonies, or export to the colonies, about the 2018 Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin. And author David Blair said this: Fiona Hill, then a White House expert on Russian affairs, was so unnerved by Mr. Trump's remarks at the joint press conference that she looked around to see if there was a fire alarm to bring the terrible spectacle to a sudden close. American officials might want to check out the fire alarms of the Alaskan venue, particularly as the stakes for this summit will be infinitely greater than they were at the Helsinki in 2018. Now just think about this. Think about what's coming this Friday. You know, when the Russians launched the Oreshnik there a couple of years ago, I was on the edge of my seat to see what the West was going to do in response to that. Mostly just kept their mouths shut and said, oh, it wasn't all that big of a deal. But we know it was because of all the ground footage that took place. The largest non-nuclear explosion in the history of the planet that we know of. And then, after attempts on the president's life a year ago in Butler, Pennsylvania, just sitting on the edge of your seat for the next few days to find out what's going to happen to the Secret Service. Nothing. The one in charge stepped down, and that was it. And there's been some other things that have happened over the last year or two or three where I'm kind of on the edge of my seat waiting to see what's going to happen. And so I'm kind of torn between these ridiculous, feeble, impotent attempts on the part of the press to paint Witkoff, who has set the stage for this meeting Friday, as some incompetent boob who's been suckered in and brainwashed by Putin. Now, Witkoff spent time with Lavrov and Putin. What was he doing there for several days in the Kremlin? Chit-chatting over borscht recipes? Or laying out what's going to happen this Friday? You don't have two men as powerful as Putin and Trump sitting down with a vague agenda. What they're going to sit down and agree to or not agree to has already been decided. The U.S. envoy that will be attending, the Russian envoy that will be attending, have all seen the agenda. They've all seen the notes. They've already seen what each side will and will not do. And Putin is not going to waste his time sitting down with Trump if Trump is going to maintain what the West has decreed for the Ukraine. I think a sixth grader could figure that out. Now, at that 2018 conference, the Helsinki one with Trump, he raised in public the dirty role that the U.S. intelligence agencies had played, that is the Russiagate, which has undermined trust in their work. So no little irony that a protege of Fiona Hill, Igor Danchenko, was revealed 3 years later to be the one to whom the Steele dossier depended to write major portions of the infamous Steele dossier. And that indicates that Hill, from the standpoint of her actual knowledge of the fraud of Russiagate, might have the compulsion to pull the fire alarm. So it remains unclear whether she arranged for Steele to employ Danchenko for the dossier. Hill did not reveal until testimony in November 2019 that when she was the director, the National Intelligence Officer, her liaison with the UK from 2006 to 2009 was nobody other than, no less than Steele himself. And so she confirmed that she had met with Steele in 2016, although it was before she knew about his dossier. She said he wanted to see if he could get a contract to some other individual who actually, I don't even recall now, she said, who he could approach about some business issues. However, when Steele was subsequently interviewed and questioned by the FBI that Hill had introduced Danchenko to him in or around 2011, she told Steele that he and his business partner should take a look at him. They did, and Danchenko was hired for the dossier in March of 2016. The Steele dossier was underway a half a year before the election. Now, in some last minute I need to do a commercial for a minute. Our heart sound recorder is back up and operating. Had another recent heart attack, not me, a very, very close friend, 51 years old. Heart attack. Fortunately, he survived it. And we did a heart sound recorder following the heart attack, the heart sound scan that we do in the office. A device that's every bit as revealing as an EKG, except it works on sound. Now, I have several medical sources that say clearly, the only way you can absolutely evaluate the immediate present state of heart function is through sound. It's one thing to look at an echocardiogram. It's another thing to look at a stress test. It's another thing to do catheterization of the coronary arteries. But they all said the same thing, and this comes from Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Harvard Med School, Yale. The only way to to interpret the current condition of the heart is through sound. What does the heartbeat sound like? What do the valves sound like? Every bit of somebody coming into your office and coughing their lungs out, you know by the sound there's something wrong with the lungs. So that's with this HSR we have in the office. It's a several $1,000 instrument. But it's one of the best things I've ever seen for evaluating the heart. We had to upgrade the system. The system has been upgraded. And I have yet to see anybody who was not raised on a farm up until their early 20s before they departed to go university or the city or whatever else, that did not show weakness of their heart function. And one of the scariest things are teenagers right now who are showing weak hearts on this scan, and how we've been able to change those to much stronger hearts simply by some dietary changes and some supplementation. It takes about a half an hour to 45 minutes. You do not have to undress. You just need thin clothing on the top half of your body. And for a bra, no underwire. You can't have an underwire support bra. It has to be just a regular bra. No clothes, nothing has to be removed. And the microphone is placed over the valves, and you can see in real time the function of the heart compared to what it's supposed to look like. And I can't be more adamant about the importance of this. I just had mine checked here a couple of weeks ago, where I can still see a few weaknesses here and there that I'm addressing personally. There is a nominal charge for it because I got to pay the person who does it. I will help to interpret the results, but I can't overemphasize how fast the heart is to recover and strengthen through some dietary changes. No organ repairs itself faster than the heart does, just as no organ suffers quicker from malnutrition than does the heart. All right, you have to call the office to make the appointment. Right now they're on Thursdays. 801-523-1890. We'll see what we can do to get you taken care of. All right, now, I know I've spent a lot of time on this subject. There's more I want to talk about, but I want to get to, because what Mertz is desperately trying to get a hold of Trump by a phone call, but it hasn't happened yet. I want to finish the program this morning with Gaza. There is no starvation in Gaza, despite all the claims you've heard from alternate media, pictures of Gazan children with their ribs exposed, lying limp in their mother's arms while their mothers look half-starved themselves. There is no starvation in Israel, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at yesterday's news conference in Israel said. And if the Prime Minister says there's no starvation, when he was asked about the matter, he said, while there is deprivation in Gaza, he said no one in Gaza would have survived after 2 years of war if Israel had really implemented a starvation policy. And then he sidestepped the question about people who are currently starving to death in Gaza to passively deny, well, you know, if there was a starvation policy being implemented to effectively kill everyone that won't leave voluntarily, you know, it kind of didn't come from us. He was never asked whether there is starvation policy whose primary aim might be not to directly kill everyone, but to drive everyone out of Gaza. Now, there's historical examples of this. In the 1940s, Poland and in Nazi Germany, where similar policies were carried out. And in the World War II concentration camps, the mission was to work the inmates, including the Reich's political enemies, to death, and then gas the ones that were deemed no longer worthy to be worked to death. That's what concentration camps were for, not to line up people and kill them, but to work them to death, where they would get about 400 calories a day in food, but put into work situations that required 4,000 calories of effort. So they slowly were worked to death. Now, here is a brief summary of the policy using food in Gaza as a weapon so far. The UN and related agencies had no logistical blockages to getting 600 trucks a day into Gaza during this last February ceasefire. That was completely stopped in March and April. From May through July, a total of 5,000 trucks have gotten through, not quite 57 a day, or 8 days worth of aid over 91 days. And that figure included the late July upsurge response by Israel, yet July averaged only 72 trucks a day. Yesterday, Monday, the figure for people starved to death and for people shot to death to get aid was at 11 apiece. There are still more people in the latter category of being shot to death, around 900 or so at the food distribution sites. Now, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Fund claimed that they distributed 7.6 million meals last week. While that is certainly a record high for them, they don't actually distribute meals. The World Food Program distributes the meals. And the Gaza humanitarian figure was devised the amount of 40-pound boxes employed as the prize in a bizarre pre-dawn 8-minute scramble reality Hunger Games. And the figure of 7.6 million meals translates into 19,000 boxes a day for more than 1 million Gazans in central or southern Gaza. In other words, 1 million people starving got 19,000 boxes of food. Now, what happens in this real-life Hunger Game is that about 8,000 to 10,000 people walk some 5 miles in the dark to line up under gunfire at each of the 4 sites. Some 4,000 to 5,000 boxes are distributed at each site. Those lucky ones who get a 40-pound box try to walk the 5 miles back, and the other 4,000 to 5,000 are supposed to take it in stride and leave the winners alone. You can't take the box away from somebody else. And to get the boxes back to their families, they have to avoid criminal gangs, some armed, some financed by the Israelis, who can avoid the 10-mile trek. Now, do those boxes translate into 57 meals per box, which would require access to water and cooking fuel? And normal aid last February and pre-October 7 included water and cooking fuel. However, since February, no water has been distributed. and that is 2 trucks of cooking gas have been delivered. 2 trucks. Normal deliveries of cooking gas were 8 truckloads a day, so Gaza has received in the last 5 months 1/4 of one day's cooking gas. They get brackish water with salt and waste in it, which is creating widespread diseases. No nation that imposes mass death on others can remain fit to survive much longer. Now, Israel is being plunged into the abyss under the leadership of King Herod, Netanyahu, and his fanatical right-wing allies. So will he now seduce that nation to attempt to massacre the remaining Palestinian population, so it might seem, in the aftermath of Thursday night's Imagine Annexation Cabinet meeting, just this last Thursday? Haaretz analyst Amos Harel raised a question: how many Gazans will actually evacuate Gaza City when the IDF order comes? Although the IDF was in the past able to quickly and aggressively evacuate hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and the Gaza Strip is in ruins, and its people are battered and exhausted after almost 2 years of war. Many people have nothing to lose, nothing left. So he writes, Amos Harel in Haaretz, it's hard to tell if they're going to flee. So according to a Friday report, The Guardian, many are already vowing to stay regardless of what the IDF says. The war has already forced thousands to find refuge in cities such as Khan Yunis and Rafah. And now, with both reduced to little more than rubble, it is unclear whether civilians escaping the new offensive can hope to live. This is from Haaretz. For this reason, while thousands are already planning yet another fight, just as many are determined to remain in Gaza City, even if it means risking their lives. How can all these people be emptied into the south, which is already overcrowded? Asked Hassam al-Sakah, a father of 2 from Gaza City. We are staying in our homes and on our land and holding on to them. I will not leave if all the weapons are pointed at my head. I see Netanyahu and Israel's propaganda as nothing more than media fireworks meant to intimidate and spread fear among the people. This will not scare us, for God is with us, and he is stronger than everyone. This is our land, and we grew up since childhood, and we will not give it up easily. I will not leave the city. I will live here, and I will die here. Okay, that's it for today, as far as K-Talk is concerned. Well, that hour went by fast. For those of you on the stream, I welcome you and to be a part of this. I thank you. There is a place for comments. If there's something I need to repeat or make clear, or something you want to add, feel free to use the comment button. But this is, tomorrow's a health show. I've got some good stuff for you tomorrow. However, this is going to be a week to watch. I am so frightened of a Reichstag taking place. Some false flag event that could forestall Friday's summit. And remember, Trump and Putin aren't sitting down like Bobby Fischer and Kasparov across a chess table. The game's already done. The chess game has already been played. Now they're going to sit down and talk about how are we going to do this and not bring about World War III from the West. All right, my friends. I hope this has been informative for you. I get a kick out of it. I've got to get to work. I've got a full schedule. And I want to repeat again, the immediacy of having your heart checked and doing something about it now before the first sign of heart problem shows up. And for 50% of the people with a major heart attack The sign ends at the end of their funeral. All right, we'll see you later. This is Jack Stockwell for Global Affairs